Good morning, everybody. We're just giving a minute for attendees to join the program and we'll get started. Good morning for those who are just joining us. We're just waiting 1 minute for all the attendees to join in and then we'll begin the program. All right, looks like that's just about everybody. So we'll get started this morning. Good morning, everybody. My name is Lucas Vebber. I'm one of the attorneys here at the Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty on our legal team. And then joining me for the webinar today is our research director, Dr. Will Flanders. We're going to be talking about the recently filed school funding lawsuit, some of the legal and policy implications there. Just try to give you a little bit of an insight into what's going on here and where this could go going forward. Begin with just a little bit about the Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty. You obviously have some idea of who we are because you found yourself here today. But for those that don't, Will is a nonprofit law and policy center based out of Milwaukee. We just moved to a new office on the Lower East Side. We engage in litigation, education, and participation in the public discourse to advance the public interest in the rule of law, individual liberty, constitutional government, and a robust civil society. Our main staff is broken into two teams, our legal team and our policy team, where we kind of work in collaboration with one another and other groups, similar like-minded groups in Wisconsin to advance our mission. So with that, we'll begin with the program today. What is this case really about? So the plaintiffs here are a group of school districts, teachers unions, and taxpayers who have filed a lawsuit in Eau Claire County, Wisconsin, with about a 100-page complaint. The basic gist of their lawsuit is they are seeking additional funding for public schools in Wisconsin. It challenges broadly just the entire education finance system in Wisconsin, basically making the argument that the legislature has not funded it adequately. It relies on a provision in our Constitution, which gives the right to a sound basic education to every Wisconsin student. The lawsuit itself doesn't challenge any specific statutory provisions. It's just kind of a broadside attack on the current system generally. As a result, there's a lot of things that could be caught up in that, including our school choice programs, the parental choice programs, the special needs scholarship, as well as certain charter schools here. They argue that funding for public schools has to come first before any of these other programs under the Constitution. Go to the next slide. Um, so this case is not the first time that these issues have come up. Most recently, there was a case about 25 years ago is when it was decided. It was brought years before that, called Vincent v. Voigt, where similar claims were made. In that case, they ultimately determined that the system did meet the constitutional standard, um, and and they kind of left it for another day if to try again, basically, and that's what this lawsuit is. So the biggest claim, as I said, in this case is that the funding system as it exists now denies a constitutional right under the Wisconsin Constitution to a sound basic education. They make six claims on there. They also make equal protection claims as well as a claim under Wisconsin's kind of good government guarantee clause. But all of the claims basically get to the heart of, they want more funding for education in Wisconsin. The remedy that they seek here is the more interesting part, perhaps, or the more important part. If they win on any of the six claims that they brought, what they're asking is that the court first throw the issue to the legislature to let the legislature have kind of the first attempt to work with the governor to address the constitutional concerns. And then they say if the legislature cannot do that or is unwilling to do that, the court should just craft its own remedy, which would be implementing a court created school finance system in Wisconsin. Again, just tremendous uncertainty with this and what they're going to do with it and what the potential outcome could be. I think any potential outcomes here would be really speculative. And again, it's just because of the broad nature of the claims here. The entire system itself is alleged to be unconstitutional. So what the system could look like if they ultimately win on those claims is really anyone's guess at this point. If the court were to declare the system unconstitutional, as I said, the legislature would be presumably given the first attempt to modify the system in a way that would meet whatever standard the court sets. And then if it doesn't, the court would impose its own system. What that system could look like, is it going to eliminate funding for the choice programs? Is it going to eliminate funding for charter schools in Wisconsin? Is it going to change the way that districts have to staff? Is it going to change, require a certain ratio of administrative staff to teaching staff? Is it going to require teacher-student ratios? It's really unknown right now, and some of that will presumably play out as the litigation, or in the event that the litigation does move forward. Go to the next one. So the next common question that we get on this is, from a legal standpoint anyways, is how fast will this case move? I think it's likely to take some time here at the trial court level. Again, this case was filed in Eau Claire County. Some of you may recall a case that was filed a few years ago at the Wisconsin Supreme Court, which was just an outright attack on the choice programs. That case was filed as an original action, which is different than this case here. So this case was filed at the trial court in Eau Claire County Circuit Court. There are complex issues and factual disputes, and Dr. Flanders is going to get into some of those issues in a little bit. But there are some significantly complex legal and factual issues in this case that are going to take some time to litigate. The case was filed in February. The response to it from the defendants is due, we calculate it, for April 13th. So we would expect that on that day there will be some responsive pleading. The existing defendants could file what's called an answer to the lawsuit. They could file a motion to dismiss in the lawsuit. The existing defendants are represented by two separate groups of attorneys. It appears that that's kind of broken down by party affiliation. The defendants now are existing lawmakers. So some are represented by one group of lawyers, some are represented by another. So it'll be a little bit different, I think, than a traditional lawsuit that we've seen. Once the trial court is done with its work, which, if there's a trial in this case, through discovery and trial could take years, maybe 2 years. I would just hazard a guess. I'm just throwing a number out there. It would then go likely to the Wisconsin Court of Appeals and then on to the Supreme Court. I say likely to the Wisconsin Court of Appeals because there is a procedure in state law and in the appellate procedure rules that allows a party to seek bypass of the Court of Appeals and try to get the case directly to the Supreme Court faster. So there are some ways that this process could be hurried up, but I would not expect a final binding decision on this case if it moves forward for years. There are also ways that this case could be shortened. If a motion to dismiss early on is granted in this case, the case would end. Presumably that would be appealed by the plaintiffs here, but that would be one way that this case could be shortened. But the bottom line is this is a very broad legal attack based on our constitutional right to a sound basic education and the current school funding system in Wisconsin. It's going to have broad ramifications on not just our public schools, but schools in the parental choice program as well. And we are going to be monitoring this going forward. And with that, I will turn this over to Dr. Flanders, who's going to talk a little bit more about some of the claims that are being made.
All right, thank you. Thank you so much, Lucas, for that overview. And I'll just note, folks, if you have questions as we go through, feel free to put them into the chat. We'll leave time to answer any questions that come up towards the end. So with that, I'm going to go over some of the sort of key allegations or claims that are made in this case. Obviously, this isn't a comprehensive list. It's, as Lucas said, it's a really long document, and there's other things that are brought up as well. First among them, that the state is failing in its duty to fund education. Lucas kind of briefly mentioned that. Specifically, they often mention this notion of 2/3 funding. We'll go into a little more depth about what that means. The second is that revenue limits are not keeping up with inflation, and they're sort of too much of a constraint on district spending. Next, referenda are now being used for basic costs. So districts are being forced to use referenda to fund things that shouldn't be put onto referenda. Next, that special education is underfunded. And then finally, again, as Lucas kind of alluded to, there's the allegation that the choice program sort of diverts funds that ought to be going first to the public school system. So we'll probably spend the most time today on the first claim here. The state isn't meeting its obligations for public education. The overall claim is that the funding system as it exists is inadequate. And one of the things they point to is that the state is not meeting the obligation to provide 2/3 funding. You hear about this idea of two-thirds funding a lot in the news media. You hear it from folks like Governor Evers. It's important to note that there is no requirement anymore for two-thirds funding under state law. That requirement was repealed in 2003. So, when folks talk about this two-thirds funding issue, I think a lot of people think it's something that is indeed required in state law, but actually it's something that's sort of aspirational or something that is used as a metric, but there's nothing that inherently requires it. One thing to note here is that our overall funding levels are actually near the highest levels that have ever been recorded, even adjusting for inflation. And even if we want to go back to the two-thirds funding level, you can see on the right-hand side here a chart that essentially shows that for the last couple of years, by the metrics that have been used by the state, we're actually exceeding that two-thirds funding level. We were about 68% during the most recent budget cycle. And the data in this chart is straight from the Legislative Fiscal Bureau, no alterations by nefarious folks like me at will here. So we're actually exceeding the metric that the plaintiffs are arguing we ought to be exceeding. Over the past decade, obviously, there have been some years where we've been below that threshold, down to a low of about 62% in 2011. But in recent years, the state share of funding has actually increased to where we're actually at that threshold again. One thing that's mentioned by the plaintiffs is this notion that when you look at that chart on the previous slide about two-thirds funding, that we're including things that ought not be included in it. And most particularly, they point to the school levy tax credit and the first dollar tax credit as including those as state effort towards education spending, they think is illogical. And the reason for that is that those are essentially ways that the state buys down property taxes. And since they're not a direct benefit to schools, they argue that that's something that we ought not be counting when we talk about two-thirds funding. But there are a couple of sound arguments for including this. The most important one, I think, is actually the second one that I have on the screen here. And that's that when we had the two-thirds funding law in place that required that as a sort of a guarantee to school districts, the levy tax credits were included in that calculation. So to say that we're not meeting the two-thirds obligation now, removing those, it's not the same conceptualization that we had of two-thirds funding when that law was actually in place. And secondly, and this is something I'll credit the Badger Institute with highlighting relatively recently, the presence of these credits is actually something that allows school districts more leeway to increase their spending via referenda. So when districts know that the state is going to bear some share of the burden when they increase their property taxes, it's not going to go fully onto the property tax rolls, then that's actually a way that the sort of property tax implications have an implication for the direct funding for schools. So, and there's some other arguments as to why this should be included, but I think the number one is that when we look back on how this used to be calculated prior to that law being repealed, these property tax credits were part of how two-thirds funding was calculated at the time. So when the allegation is made that we're not meeting our obligations for students, I think it's important to look at where we actually stand in terms of school funding in the state. The chart on the right-hand side shows at the top, the blue line is overall total funding from all the sources that you see in the lower lines there. The bottom line is that the most recent numbers from DPI were at $18,592 per student in revenue per it's actually revenue per member, which is a little bit of a nuanced definition that we'll get in later on. In inflation adjusted numbers, which the chart on the right is inflation adjusted, we're spending more than we were in 2000, and we're extremely close to the total revenue per member that we had at the high point of all time, which is in 2011. If you look on the chart around 2011, you see that high water mark, and then you see a decline. That's the point we're talking about. We were at about 18,606 then. We're at 18,592 today. And as you look at that decline right after 2011, you'll note that was the time frame when Act 10 was implemented in the state of Wisconsin. So essentially, there was a decline in total spending during that time. There was a decline in state aid during that time, but districts enjoyed billions of dollars in savings from the implementation of Act 10. The McIver Institute has estimated $35 billion, I think is their most recent number. For school districts, we did an annual look and we estimated $1.6 billion annually in savings from Act 10. So, when you look at this data, given how close we are to the all-time highs, inflation adjusted, there's really no argument that overall spending has suffered as a result of decisions made by the legislature. Indeed, we're very close to the all-time highs, and you have billions of dollars in savings that ought to be included in that as well. The next point is that the argument for more money essentially is based on the notion that if we spend more money, we might be getting better outcomes. But really, there's little evidence to suggest that that's the case. I always point to Eric Hanushek, who's a scholar at Stanford University. He's been sort of the preeminent expert on the relationship between funding and student outcomes for many years. There's been a slight change in recent years. It used to be said by Hanushek and others that there's really no evidence that funding can matter. Now I think that he would say that there may be some evidence that targeted funding can make some difference. But again, that's not really what's being asked for here, right? It's sort of spending more money overall and giving more money to districts. Little reason to think that that would make a difference. And even beyond that, we can look at data from the state here in Wisconsin. What you see on the chart here is English language proficiency or English language arts proficiency on the forward exam for the most recent year of data. And each gray dot here represents a school district in the state. I pointed out in green with the names of the school districts that are part of this lawsuit. But what you can see is that as spending goes up in Wisconsin, there's actually a slight negative relationship. The more districts spend, the lower proficiency is. Now, we're not going to make the claim here that if you added more money to the system, proficiency would go down. But essentially, we see no evidence that spending more would make proficiency go up. And if you look at each of these individual districts, Beloit, Green Bay, Adams Friendship, and the others, you'll notice that at the level of spending that each of these districts have, there are plenty of dots above them. There are plenty of districts with the same or very similar levels of spending where proficiency is significantly higher. So again, perhaps these districts ought to look at what some of these districts with significantly better outcomes with similar levels of spending are doing, because there is evidence that better outcomes could be achieved at similar costs. Finally, the claim is that we're sort of, it's the first time I've ever seen school districts sort of engage with the proficiency data. In some ways, I'm glad to see that, because we generally have complained about the low proficiency levels in the state. But when you look at the data, proficiency around the country is suffering is the bottom line. And there's no reason to think the Wisconsin funding system is a particular cause for this problem. What you see on the right-hand side here are results from the most recent NAEP around the country in 2024. And Wisconsin is the light blue line, and the national average is the darker line. And what you can see is over time, Wisconsin very much follows the national trend. So when we think about the nation as a whole, we have states where funding has dramatically increased. We have states that funding maybe relative to others has gone down. But what you see with our state is that our funding approach has essentially kept us on par with the nation as a whole over time. And another thing to note is that if you follow Will's work, the organization Will, not me individually, but if you follow our work, you've seen that our state report cards have been adjusted. Our forward exam scores and expectations have been lowered. The vast majority of school districts in the state are rated as meeting or exceeding expectations. 0 districts in the state have been rated as failing to meet expectations, including districts like Milwaukee and Beloit with very low proficiency. So by that metric, it's difficult to see how the claim can be made that our students are being failed, again, given the system that's been set up by school districts and the DPI as a whole. The second claim that we want to address is that revenue limits are too low. And you can see, looking at the data, that we have similar average revenue limits adjusted for inflation as we did in the year 2000. But it is true that our revenue limits overall are a bit lower, adjusted for inflation, than 2010 overall peak in revenue limits. But I think an important nuance to this argument is to note that spending outside of the revenue limit has gone up over time. So if you go back to 2000 or 2010, we did have categorical aids, but spending within categorical aids has increased over time. I note one here, which is the per pupil revenue. And this is revenue that didn't exist in 2010. And now that's $742 per student that exists outside of the revenue limit. So the total picture of spending that we went through on the previous slide, we argue is sort of a better way to capture what's actually being spent on schools than the revenue limit, just because over time we've spent more and more money outside of those revenue limits. You can argue whether doing that was a good idea. Maybe more money should have gone through the revenue limit system. But the bottom line is to get a total picture of spending. The revenue limit is no longer the best picture. I noted here that Beloit is an exception. Beloit has seen a decline in overall revenue limit authority over time that's sort of greater than what we see in some other districts. But we'll discuss subsequently here some nuance as to why that might be the case. So this is where we get into a really in the weeds sort of an issue. But I mentioned earlier that when we look at revenue in the state, it's usually listed as revenue per member. But enrollment and membership are actually quite different things in the state of Wisconsin. And particularly in this era of declining enrollment, where we see the number of kids enrolled in schools going down over time, the membership number is no longer always that representative of the number of heads of actually in a classroom. So for instance, when we compare enrollment and membership, one key difference is that students who open enroll into another district are counted in the membership count, but they're now not counted in the enrollment count. And that's a big driver in Beloit, along with charter schools where a similar notion applies. But what you see here is that if you look at the membership count, Beloit has seen a big decline in their enrollment from 6,800 in 2000 to 4,776 today. But their membership has stayed much more similar. It's much more on par with the enrollment numbers that we saw several years ago. And so when we use membership in the case of Beloit, we're really sort of masking what's actually happening with the amount of funding that's available for each student in the classroom. And when you use enrollment instead of membership, you see that Beloit is actually much better off than we generally think. They're at about 14,247 per enrollee versus the 11,281 in revenue limit authority if we use the membership number. So it doesn't work this way for every district. If you're a district that has a large number of students that are open enrolling into the district rather than out, then these numbers can be reversed. But in the context of cities like Beloit, in the context of a city like Milwaukee, where students are generally enrolling out of the district, it makes the districts look poorer than they actually might be when we use those membership and enrollee numbers. When we were a growing state, membership was more of a lagging indicator because your membership would tend to be behind actual enrollment. As we're shrinking, losing population, particularly in the public school sector, then it's sort of a leading indicator, and it tends to again mask what's actually happening in terms of how much money is being spent per kid that's actually in the classroom. I argue some adjustments here might be something for the legislature to look into because again, membership doesn't always capture what's happening in our classrooms today. Another interesting claim in this case is that districts are sort of being forced into referendum and that referenda are being used to meet basic district needs. It certainly is the case that the number of referenda has gone up over time for school districts. But if it was the case that this was being used simply for basic operational costs, you might think that districts that are spending less overall or getting less in total revenue would be going to referendum more than districts that are at the other end of the spectrum. And we don't really see that to be the case to any large extent. So what you see on the right-hand side, I compared the rate of going to referendum over the past two cycles based on whether a district was below or above the average per district revenue per member. And while there's about a 4% gap, obviously it's not really substantively significant. About 44% of districts below the average went to referendum, 40% of districts above. So, this suggests, and it's not definitive, that in general, referendums are representing more of a choice rather than a necessity. But above all that, this is sort of more of a non-data argument and more of a sort of philosophical one. The referenda are inherently a way for voters to have a role in deciding how much money schools have to spend on the children in the area. And there's wisdom in not sort of having a state or a court impose a particular number when voters have the ability through referenda to make those decisions for themselves. One of the probably more interesting arguments, and one where maybe there's a little more credibility than in some of the others, is that we're spending too little on special education. But I think where they do have a point, and something that can't be ignored, is that around the country, the number of students identified with special needs has been going up over time. This isn't a Wisconsin-only phenomenon. You can look at the national numbers. You can look at almost every state individually, and you'll see the number of students diagnosed with disabilities is increasing. Wisconsin is near the national average in terms of the share of students that are diagnosed with disabilities. But it's important to think about this potential for overdiagnosis here. So particularly outside of Wisconsin, when school districts receive a significant reimbursement rate for students with special needs, there is an incentive put in place for increasing the number of diagnoses. And folks that have been in schools or had students in schools can sort of see how this process works. We have other work that deals with sort of chaotic classrooms. Teachers want their classrooms to be more under control. Sometimes there's a suggestion that maybe a student ought to be looked into for some emotional problems or some medication for ADHD. Not saying those are never necessary, but those sorts of problems are where we're seeing the increase over time, is in these sort of more emotional behavioral issues in general, though there's some other increases too. So our funding system does, not fund special needs students quite as heavily as some other states. And maybe there's some positive sides to that as well. Wisconsin ranks 37th in the country in terms of the growth in the rate of disability over time. And I looked at percentage point growth here, but you could look at percentage growth as well. The chart on the right-hand side shows the top 10 states where disability rates have grown the most. And then I put Wisconsin down there at 37th at the bottom. We saw less than 1 percentage point increase since 2000 in disability rates, whereas a state like Pennsylvania has seen an almost 8% increase in disability rates over that time frame. So again, we're not necessarily making the case that no changes could be made here, and there could be some room for improvements to our special education funding. We've written in the past that weighted student funding might be something that the legislature should look at, particularly in the case of disabilities. But you have to balance that with the need to, or with the problem of creating incentives for increased diagnosis. Well, I'll go back here for 1 second. One thing I missed on this slide is the third bullet point. We do already have a high cost special needs reimbursement rate for students that are particularly expensive for school districts. So, when public school folks talk about the low reimbursement rate, they often ignore the existence of that program that for those that are over $30,000 in costs, I believe it is, there is a 90% reimbursement rate, which is on par with what they complain about for school choice kids. So the final main claim in this that we're going to discuss here today is that school choice programs are undermining public school spending. And the chart on the right-hand side here shows, just sort of the picture of how this funding works. On the rightmost pie chart on the top, you see the percentage of enrollment that school choice kids represent around the state, and they represent about 8.5% of enrollment. They do represent an ever so slightly larger share of state expenditure at about 10.5%. But if you look at the total picture of funding, these kids are 8.5% of enrollment, but only 4.75% of overall expenditure. This is including, local funding, including federal funding, et cetera. So again, the choice students are overall, from the perspective of state taxpayers, they're cheaper. And for a lower cost, our apples to apples paper, a lot of other work shows we're getting similar or better results. So we're getting a better bang for the buck from taxpayers. Now, there is a problem, and it's something we won't fully get into in this presentation here today, where the way that our system works is that school districts lose funding for students who go to the choice program, and then they're allowed to raise property taxes to make up for the lost funding. There have been arguments, and we've advocated for totally removing that connection. It's something called decoupling, where choice enrollment would have no impact whatsoever on property taxes or on school district funding. It would be completely independent. The Milwaukee Public Schools and the Milwaukee Choice Program are already decoupled, so Milwaukee doesn't sort of have this backdoor property tax implication. But the WASB convention rejected decoupling. We've seen that the governor in the previous legislative session rejected decoupling. So it seems as if and there may be other reasons. The picture is certainly that they'd rather have the issue than they would the remedy, which is to again decouple the spending from each other. But again, this is the picture we have currently for overall taxpayers. There's a savings. And if folks are concerned about the property tax implications, a remedy has already been proposed in the legislature, and it's incumbent on a lot of the same folks that are bringing this lawsuit if they'd be willing to accept that remedy. But again, it seems like the overall goal might be to end school choice rather than to come up with a solution. So again, I kind of went through this here. The arguments on the other side at the bottom bullet points there that this is sort of a stealth effort to implement universal school choice. Obviously, while folks like us are proponents of universal school choice, these really are not similar policies. And then the argument is this is somehow less transparent to decouple the spending. But obviously, if we decouple the spending, there'll be a clean line item in the state budget. That'll be private school choice funding. That'll be independent charter funding. So it's about as transparent as you could possibly be. So I'll just note if you've if you have other questions that we don't answer here today, we are putting out an explainer here today, which is sort of an FAQ on a lot of the stuff we've gone over, and then a little bit more depth on it. And we'll have that available on our website today for folks that want to take a look. It's a pretty lengthy document, longer than a lot of the policy reports we like to produce here at Will, but it is something that hopefully will give some more depth on some of the stuff that we've discussed. So just some conclusions here. Our funding levels overall are at historic highs, and to ignore that in the context of this case is again, it doesn't seem reasonable. We're spending as much on schools inflation adjusted as we almost ever have. Our system is working as it's designed to work. Our funding formula essentially takes money from wealthier districts and redistributes it to districts with less property value per student. So again, you may not like that system, but the solution there is there's political remedies there, right? There's changes that can be made to the funding system through political means, through working with the governor and the legislature, not necessarily going to the court, because the system is doing what it was designed to do. There are challenges. We mentioned the special needs funding, and there's room to make adjustments there. But again, we think the solution to that is to work through policy reform rather than a court implemented system with folks that don't have the deepest understanding necessarily because they can't. They wouldn't be expected to of how our school finance system currently works. So with that, I will invite any questions. Again, if you have questions, please feel free to put them into the chat, and we'll look and see what we have so far. Oh, and I did neglect to mention, I had it on the slide there, that our school board summit is coming up. This will be an all-day opportunity to hear about a lot of aspects of policy that involve school districts, from the legal implications from some of the recent decisions on Title IX to a deeper dive into school finance reform. Eric is going to put the link to register into the chat, and then we have until April 16th for registration. So with that, now I'll turn it over to see if folks have any Q&A questions. I see a couple in here. From Joey. Joey says, is there a similar chart to show the money spent compared to proficiency that adds in total property tax info, or any other census data that can compare community wealth to proficiency? So that's a good question. I think that there is a relationship. Certainly, I can admit, I can say this: our wealthier districts do tend to do better overall. And this is something you can see in Wisconsin. This is something you can see all over the country. Poverty is the biggest correlate of student outcomes, unfortunately, of really any factor that you can look into. Um, but our funding system doesn't necessarily mean that those districts with wealthier families tend to actually have the most money. In Wisconsin, the districts that have the most money are actually per student are actually rural districts with a lot of vacation homes and not necessarily the wealthiest or the most residents. But certainly there is a correlation between funding and student outcomes, and we wouldn't want to deny that. And again, if you think about more targeted reforms, that wouldn't be what this lawsuit necessarily is getting into. Maybe there's some adjustments to be made there. Second question from Brad. We just had this exact attack in the Osh Herald this Wednesday. They're wanting to show a line on the property taxes, showing how much taxpayers are spending for vouchers like ours. This is something we have seen around the state. Districts like Racine and Green Bay have added the property tax line to their sort of explaining how much is going to the private schools. Again, we think the ultimate remedy is decoupling. But one thing that's also important to note is they don't necessarily put onto those explainers some of the other factors that also affect the amount of property taxes that are being paid. Other things affect it, like kids leaving the district. If you have declining enrollment, that affects your property tax share. If you have kids open enrolling out of the district, that can affect the property tax share as well. So there are other factors that play a role as well. Obviously, we're for transparency, but we don't think folks are always coming to this with transparency in mind. From John Humphreys, and this one's probably more for Lucas, any chance this whole thing will be dismissed? Our analysis suggests the basis of the suit is pretty weak.
Yeah, that's a good question too, John. I tried to briefly tee that up a little bit in my remarks, but with any lawsuit, there's a time to file what's called the responsive pleading here, and that'll be due on April 13th. We'll kind of see what the current defendants do. It wouldn't surprise me, and typically in these types of lawsuits, there is a motion to dismiss that's filed, and that would be briefed out at the beginning of the lawsuit, really before discovery and that fact-finding process starts. So. I don't know. I can't really handicap what the chances of that would be, granted or not. But obviously, based on what we've presented here today, I think we would agree that I think the basis for the suit is pretty weak, both factually and as a matter of law. So, that's something to keep an eye on, and I think something that'll play out in the not too distant future.
Thanks, Lucas. From Representative Whitkey, can you comment on the open enrollment impact on this lawsuit? 73,000 kids in 24, 25 in open enrollment versus 54,000 in choice. The program redistributed 618 million in state aid, and then districts with the highest open enrollment, like Milwaukee and Racine, have gone to referendum. I think that is an important point. One thing we brought up in the presentation here is the role that open enrollment plays in Beloit. And it does affect the district resources, right? Because there's a redistribution to the receiving district. I think the reason that you see less complaints about it is because to some extent, both the receiving and donor, quote unquote, donor district benefit to some extent. There's a skim off the top that we no longer see when it comes to public school choice, or excuse me, to private school choice and to some of our charter school programs. But it is certainly something that changes the amount of aid per student, and it does play an important role and something that needs to be sort of examined in this context for sure. From Scott Manley, does the DPI report card undermine the plaintiff's argument that students aren't being given their constitutionally guaranteed education? Also, have you tried to correlate funding with either NAEP achievement or DPI report card scores for districts? So yeah, great question there. So on the first part, yeah, I think certainly a key argument to be made is that as we mentioned, the state defines no school districts as failing to meet expectations, right? So if you're going to make the claim that our schools are being under-resourced and the outcomes are poor, it's hard to do that when you have a DPI report card in place that sort of shows that things are going pretty well. It paints a rosy picture. In the second part of the question, we correlated funding with either NAEP achievement or DPI scores. I think nationally, you could look at the NAEP. Unfortunately, for NAEP for Wisconsin, we only have district-specific data for Milwaukee. The DPI scores are kind of what I showed earlier, where well, I guess I use the proficiency data, but if you look at the DPI overall scores, it does present a similar picture, and that's something that should be looked into or
And
highlighted as well. So great
and
thoughts there.
well, if I could just add on
Go ahead, Lucas.
to answer that as well, I think to that last question on do the report cards undermine it? I think as a matter of law, they certainly do as well. I think it's the report cards didn't exist the last time this case was brought before the Supreme Court. So the Vincent v. Voigt decision existed. There really weren't any of these measurable standards statewide. Wisconsin has since implemented these. One of the problems this suit has, right, is it's asking the court to sort of invent its own standard as to, what is adequate, what is not. Vincent v. Voigt didn't provide any information on that. The complaint in this case doesn't provide any suggestions on how the court should do that. So really, how much is adequate, how much is not? That's sort of the key question here. I think the existence of the report cards, which are responding to, of course, federal mandates for those, and it's now in state law, certainly, and the fact that the overwhelming majority of school districts in Wisconsin meet the requirements under those, meet expectations or better, certainly undermines the legal claims that are made here.
Thanks, Lucas. This one might also be geared toward you to some extent, at least. It says, from Quinton, school districts have different base revenue limits. The folks here are arguing that this prevents districts from being as uniform as practical. If overturned, does this require redrawing the funding system from scratch, or could you simply raise the low revenue floor for those districts to assuage the court?
Yeah, really good question there, Quentin, too. And I think this kind of gets back to exactly what they're challenging and what the remedy would be. I think if they are successful in any of their challenges, all options are on the table as to what this could look like to fix it going forward. I know that's not a very good answer to the question, but I think really yes, anything's possible here. They could start from scratch. They could just try to nibble around the edges and fix it, but the door is open for a lot of change if they do ultimately succeed in any of these claims.
Yeah, also you can nibble around the edges like special needs funding and stuff like that too. But again, that's hard to tell. Again, from Representative Whitkey, any impact from Evers' 400-year veto? The Supreme Court determined his veto was constitutional, and it was constitutional veto affecting school funding. Your thoughts there, Lucas?
Yeah, I mean, I think that just making into some of the, I guess, revenue limit authority and some of the revenue limit arguments that are made. I don't think, again, any change here, if they do win on any of these claims, any remedy may involve revenue limits as well, and could directly affect, the impacts of that veto or not.
And one more here. And again, if you guys have any further questions, feel free to jump in now because we're down to our last question at the moment. But from Scott again, could an unfavorable court decision jeopardize open enrollment?
Yes, I think that's certainly in the realm of possibility. I think that again, that they just sort of it's a broadside challenge to the school finance system generally in Wisconsin. So if they do win on that, and the remedy they ask is just basically to fix it. So if they do win on that, is it infusing more money into the existing system? Is it tweaks to the existing system? I think open enrollment as well as a variety of other programs throughout the state could be in the crosshairs and could be directly impacted by this. Good question.
Yeah, and one thing we didn't discuss fully that's related to this is that we had it on the slide there, but we mentioned districts that have high property taxes already might be even worse off. So essentially, what's one of the arguments here is that we're not redistributing enough to districts with a lot of low income students. Already, we have a funding system that sort of works to equalize aid across districts, but if you're going to pull even more money to those districts, then a lot of public school districts that might be currently happy with their funding system could see more on their property tax bills as well under some sort of a remedy for this. So again, as Lucas said, we don't know exactly what would be called for. So that's seeing no further oh, wait, we do have one more right here at the end from Quentin again. So Pennsylvania also had a high funding in relation to its history and high spending nationally, but the funding system got overturned. Do you know how they won that case and how would that apply to Wisconsin?
Yeah, I can feel that. I don't know Pennsylvania specific. We have started looking into this Wisconsin litigation is not unique. This has been brought in many other states as well. So this is kind of a tactic that's been tried in other places. I have not yet got to Pennsylvania on the research list yet, though, so I can't comment directly on that.
All right. Well, those were some great questions. Did we get one more in here? Sorry, I keep trying to close out, and then we got another one from John. I was surprised at the lack of focus on districts with low revenue limits, aside from the fact that the plaintiffs are all low revenue limit. A resolution would probably kick the whole system back to the legislature to resolve problems with the system, right? Yeah, I think Lucas, we said that's the first remedy, right? Is that it first goes back to the legislature.
Yeah, that's what the plaintiffs have requested here. Basically, first it goes to the legislature, and then if the legislature doesn't solve it, then it would go to the court to sort of resolve it on its own.
Awesome. Well, again, thank you guys so much, and please do feel free to email us. We had it up on the screen. I can reshare here if it's well, if it's not showing for folks, but it's Flanders at will-law.org and Lucas at will-law.org. So relatively easy ones to remember. Please do check out our write up on this. It'll give you a little more detail, and don't forget to register if you're interested for our school board summit. Again, we have another week till April 16th, a week and a half till April 16th to get that done. So thanks, folks, again for taking the time today.
Thanks for joining us, everyone.